from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I am most pleased to welcome you to the 9th program of our series titled Journey Through Time, What Happened in the Western World in the Second Millennium. On today's program, we have 3 guests from past history. These guests were artists, writers, and one was a scientist. We're very delighted to have those 3 people here as they've journeyed through time. And later in the program, I shall introduce who is portraying those 3 people. First of all, I would welcome in this journey that we're having to our program, first of all, Rachel Carson, who lived from 1907 until 1964. She was a writer and an American scientist. Ms. Carson, it's a pleasure to bring you into 1999 and talk about what your contributions were in the second millennium. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Our second guest today is Scott JOPLIN, who lived from 1868 until 1917. He was a great composer and a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he too has returned here in 1999. And Mr. JOPLIN, welcome to our program, and we want to talk about your music and how it changed the world, really, in many ways.
Good to be here. Thank you.
And our third guest is Georgia O'Keeffe, who lived from 1887 to 1986, was an American muralist and a painter, and her works have been recognized for what they were, great contributions in that particular millennium. Ms. O'Keeffe, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And I'm pleased to have our 2 regular panelists who've been with us on this journey for a number of weeks, and we want to continue. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And Janelle Burke will commence the questioning with our 3 very famous people in history.
Rachel Carson, let's begin with you. Many people in our time may not know who you are and what you did. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, your contributions?
Sure. I am a marine biologist, but before I studied science, I was very much a writer. I wrote poetry and stories. I was very much excited by biology in college. Later, I took a job at the Department of Interior and in the Fish and Wildlife. And it was there that I began writing pamphlets and edited government publications. And then I wrote on my own several books about the sea, the Atlantic Ocean in particular, up and down the coast from Maine to Florida. And then I began my work on Silent Spring in 1960. And in that book, I was most passionate about letting the general public, know what the principles of ecology and how ecosystems work and how man can affect the ecosystem in completely devastating the ecosystem and the planet in general by my studies of the use of DDT and other herbicides and pesticides.
Now, Mr. JOPLIN, your music is very popular in our time. What did you call your music, and how did you develop it?
Well, it was called a lot of things. When I was young, very, very young, I was able to listen to my father, who was only 5 years out of slavery, play the songs and sing the songs and dance the songs that came from the plantation in the South. We started out life in Northeast Texas, and we spent a great deal of time entertaining ourselves, and the songs came from the traditions that go back to, I believe, to Africa, and that we brought with us and developed over at least 200 years in this country.
So you incorporate a lot of rhythms.
A lot of rhythms, a lot of songs that came from perhaps back beyond memory.
Natural tunes.
Natural tunes, a lot of dancing. We weren't allowed to use drums on the plantations, but we used to slap our thighs and clap our hands and slap our instruments, and that and throw handkerchiefs. And that was somewhere in that experience was the rag. Now, some people think that it was a ragged rhythm, and we did use a lot of syncopation, but so rag came to be, and long before the white man got interested in it in the 1890s, particularly in the Chicago World's Fair.
And Georgia O'Keeffe, it was unusual in your day for a woman to be known as an artist. How did you come to be recognized?
Well, I think that I would start talking about that from about 1915, when I decided to set aside my traditional education and start to just make shapes that seemed to be in my mind. It was as if my mind knew more about what I was thinking than I did. And so I made many of these drawings, and I sent them off to my friend Anita Politzer in New York, and wanted a response from her. And she decided on her own to send them or take them to Alfred Stieglitz. And Alfred Stieglitz was an artist, he was a photographer, and he was an impresario for many artists, and he had a gallery in New York, 291. And this gallery housed the work of many well-known artists. In fact, it was the first gallery where Picasso showed his work in the United States. And so Stieglitz responded favorably to my work, and eventually my work was shown in 291. Along with that, Stieglitz and I not only carried on an art relationship, but a love relationship. And 9 years from that time, we were married. And so I would say that a lot of my effectiveness as an artist in terms of being known is related to Alfred Stieglitz. Not that I certainly didn't have the work to show for what I did, but being a woman, it was advantageous for me to be able to show my work in his gallery. And he, of course, lured me to New York and told me that he would support me, and that made it very advantageous for me because I could make art. And so the art I made was shown, and the art I made was sold, and I had a lot of freedom as an artist to be an artist and be an artist throughout my life. Fortunate for me because it was my one true passion and the one thing that I continue to do and thrive on throughout my life.
Steve Sheen.
Ms. Carson, in our time, environmental issues are still often somewhat controversial. How was were your thoughts and your writings in Silent Spring accepted in your day?
Well, the chemical companies that produced the pesticides and herbicides that we discovered were poisonous to the environment were not happy with what we'd found. In fact, many of my notes and findings were from sources within the government who did not want their identity to be known because they feared that they would be in trouble and they would lose their jobs. Also, the chemical companies made a lot of money, and they offered positions to scientists that the biological community did not. So there was a lot of tension between the industry of the chemical company and people like myself who were finding that the products that they were producing were poisonous and caused cancer, among many other things. Luckily, I managed to produce the book. I had a wonderful publisher who took very good care of me so that I did not have to worry about losing my job, and helped me to produce the book. And it was very well received, and eventually President Kennedy decided to look into the facts that I had found and gradually the Environmental Protection Agency grew out of that group.
So popular, the public received the work well, but some interest did not. Is that a fair summary?
That's true. The chemical industry did come after me. They published things about me, saying that I was, one of the things that they said was that I was a spinster and I did not have any children, therefore could I be interested in genetics? But most of the public understood that what was happening was that wildlife was dying, and many people already knew that there were problems in their backyards from the use of these chemicals. So gradually, the acceptance by the broader public overwhelmed the chemical community.
Thank you. Mr. Joplin, was it difficult for you as a black man to have your music accepted generally?
Well, I think that falls into perhaps two answers. One is that ragtime was an immediate success. As a result
broad
of
success?
Yes,
okay.
Broad success. And it caused me to be called King of Ragtime. Mm-hmm. It was the first sheet music that sold over 500,000 copies. Actually, I understand in my return that it sold over 1 million copies in the first 20 years of its life. I think probably the biggest problem that I had as a black person was not my ragtime, but the opera that I tried to get published and produced. I published it, but couldn't get it produced, and it's a great satisfaction to me to come back and discover that this opera was finally produced in 1972 and 75 in Houston, in Atlanta and Houston, and that is probably the reason that the Pulitzer Prize was awarded posthumously.
And you wrote that in what year?
1911 was the year that I published it, but I've been working on it. In fact, it probably was the reason that I had so many financial difficulties. I could not find any white publishers to publish it because they couldn't conceive of a black person publishing truly the first American grand opera. And I couldn't find much support in the black community because it was about a part of the black existence that had been missed by the people in the North, the Negroes in the North.
And just one last quick question. Did ragtime, its popularity soar in all segments of society equally, or did it take off first in the black community and
well,
then...
it had been in the black community for decades and decades into the 19th century, but after the 1890s, it almost became a white man's tune.
Interesting, thank you. And Miss O'Keefe, I'm a fan of your work. How would you describe it? For someone who hadn't seen any of your paintings, how would you describe your work?
I would describe my work as a personal vision, and I would say that when people looked at my work, people looked at my work because they were forced to look at my work. I made my work large enough so that people could see what I saw, so they could see how I felt about what it was that I wanted to paint. And so I might be painting a clamshell that would be very, very small, and they would look at that clamshell and notice it because of its largeness and then be amazed that it was a clamshell. So a form that would ordinarily be very small along the water's edge would be looked at very differently because it was amplified and a much larger scale than they would be used to.
And if Mr. Stewart will give me time for one more quick question. I was fortunate to see an exhibit of your work at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. 5 or 6 years ago. Up until that time, and what I would like you to do is sort of react to my reaction to seeing a broader spectrum of your work. I thought of you as an artist of single blossoms of desert flowers. That's anytime I thought of George O'Keeffe, that's what came to mind. And I was surprised and pleased to see that your work is much broader than that. Is that a problem you encounter generally, or just my personal affliction?
Well, I suppose it's what you want to look at and how much you've seen of a person's work. Mm-hmm. And when I say what you want to look at, it's what you respond to. I don't have any control over what people choose to look at related to my work and how they respond to it. But
are
the
those
flowers,
paintings that I'm describing, are those your favorite works?
Well, the work that I made was about what I did with where I've been. And to speak about one particular image is impossible because it was a way of life for me. It wasn't a matter of selecting one image that was my favorite. It's a documentation of how I lived.
Thank you.
My first question is going to be to Georgia O'Keeffe also. I've always been fascinated with artists, and of course we're so privileged to have you to journey through time, be with us, such a great artist. As you did your works, and as Steve Shink has indicated, people react to your works, and they praise them, they criticize them. You're out there as a subject. Did you spend much time being concerned about how your work would send a certain message, or did you simply say that all individuals have to determine for themselves if they like it or if they get the proper message? Or is there a proper message when you're painting? As you come back in time, I want to get you to react. There's been some time since your death, how people have responded to your work.
When I painted, I didn't paint for a response.
Okay.
I painted because I had to paint, because I wanted to paint. So the public wasn't really my focus. I did paint a few murals in my life, and I found that when I was involved with the public, with a responsibility attached to the public, that was detrimental to the way that I could really focus and work. It wasn't something that I chose to do. I painted because I saw things in a particular way, and I responded to the way that I saw things. But the way that I saw things and the way that I painted, of course, was interpreted very differently by many. They, of course, saw many different things in my paintings. They saw in my paintings sexual implications. They saw female characteristics. And that's what they saw. And that's what I claimed until the day that I died. This is what you saw, but not what I saw when I painted them.
One other quick question. On this program, a couple of years ago, we had an artist that's still alive today. And in interviewing him, I was so taken by the fact that in his time, he does two things. He does his sculpture work and other types of work out of his own inner self and his happiness and his enjoyment. But he also is doing some commercial work that he's hired to do certain things. And he says that his essence doesn't come out when he's paid to do it, that his great true artistic abilities are lost in that. Did you have any of that experience, or was all your work from you and not worrying about any commercial rewards?
Well, I think that the greatest satisfaction comes from being united with what you're doing. When you're doing it because you want to be doing it, and your mind is therefore connected with that activity. But of course, when you're doing something for the public, then you are doing something for the public. So your mind is connected to a responsibility that you have and a result that they are going to be evaluating. And their result, the result that they are evaluating, is very different than the result that I am evaluating. And that provided a lot of tension for me.
Yeah.
And I did become involved with that with a couple of murals, but beyond that, I decided that, no, my work was in the studio. Even in the studio, I can be making work and not be very happy about what I'm doing at the time. Moments of satisfaction are not always there as an artist.
Like other fields, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't.
It's very much a love-hate relationship sometimes.
Thank you. Mr. Joplin, my question for you is, as someone, certainly you're called the king of ragtime, and you've gone down in history as a remarkably gifted person, as the other two guests are. A question I ask oftentimes when we have this opportunity is, what drove you to have such incredible accomplishments? And I guess the question encompasses, why did you concentrate on the particular type of music, ragtime? Because was it because of your roots and your history? But secondly, what motivated you to? You had to spend an awful lot of time. You had to give a lot of your life, your passion to this. What causes people throughout history in this 1,000 years we've been looking at? What set you aside to give that kind of commitment? And also, I know the talent that was there.
I think probably from the very beginning I was interested in music, and playing the piano was when I really found a lot of response to what I was doing. I was really bringing together the roots of the Negro tradition, and it was a great surprise to me how way beyond the Negro community the music caught fire. And I was interested in getting the music composed so that it would be preserved, whereas most of my colleagues were interested in simply playing, and we all played in bordellos, which today you would call houses of prostitution, saloons and places like that, because that was the only place that Negroes could make a living with their music. But I was driven to preserve it in its best, and that's why I was so taken with the idea that a Negro could publish the first American grand opera, and finally to learn that it had been done, even though I couldn't be there for it.
So that would be a great reward for all the time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
My final question on this round is to Rachel Carson, and you too are in this category of great accomplishments, and of all your works and all your accomplishments, what are you most proud of? Why does it stand out beyond the other work that you did?
I would have to say Silent Spring is probably my
Can you speak a little louder?
Silent Spring is my proudest achievement, because I didn't really want to write that book. I didn't really want to take on the responsibility of going toe-to-toe with people in the chemical industry, as I said before. I was hoping that another scientist would come along and write about this topic. And once I got started on it, there was so much evidence, there were so many reports, there was so much that was going unsaid, that I knew that I had to do this, and I had to save what was now our planet, our environment. I found that on almost no place on this planet, except for perhaps maybe the South Pole, that everything, every cell, every geographic location had been affected by DDT. And I couldn't stand to think that generations after us would suffer from the effects.
Okay, thank you. We're getting short on time. We're going to go out of character in a moment, but I'm going to ask something very different. Janelle gets to ask one person one question. Steve, one person one question, then I'll take you out of character.
Georgia O'Keeffe, the question is for you. What do you call your style of painting?
I would call my style of painting abstract. I have been referred to as a biomorphic abstractionist, which means that I use organic form. I worked from real life imagery, but I worked in a way that was very personal. I made images large so that people could see what I wanted them to see. And it was very abstract because I did enlarge my work for the most part.
Steve Sheen.
Mr. Joplin, you mentioned earlier in the show that you had some financial difficulties, and you related those to the opera that really wasn't published in your lifetime. Did you overcome those?
No, I never did. I never did. I died in a mental hospital in New York City, almost poverty-stricken.
Do you attribute the illness in part to the difficulties that you had with the financial aspects of your career?
Financial, and also just a lifelong history of some bad choices, even.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's important to go out of character for a moment, and I want to introduce Andrea Carter, who is here and has portrayed Rachel Carson. Andrea Carter is a member of the faculty in the English department, and just like in 30 seconds, that's unfair to you, but by playing this role now, what has it done for you personally?
It's definitely made me more appreciative of what went before in the environmental world, in the world of environmentalists and environmentalism. I didn't know that much about Silent Spring. Even though I had read it, I didn't realize what she was trying to do with that book and how much she accomplished.
When you play like this, you get more depth, don't you? More
Oh
understanding.
my gosh, yes.
It changes you in some ways, I'm sure. The next introduction is Dave Remington, who is a member of the staff at North Idaho College Library, and he's worked in some very, very special places. Library of Congress, I believe, is one of those. And he's been here to play Scott Joplin. I know that, Dave, it's been difficult for you in one sense where you had such admiration for Joplin, but not being African American yourself. But how has all this affected you?
Well, it's been great to know the man, to really know the man who wrote the music I played for 20 years. And it's also been an experience to try to understand what it means to be black when you're a white man.
As a non-black person, yeah. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure it's added to some strength to you. And
absolutely, yes. Absolutely, very rich.
Our third person is a member of the faculty also that I've known a long time, Allie Vogt, and she is in the art department and teaches art. And Allie, you have admired Georgia O'Keeffe for a long time. What's it meant to you?
Well, first of all, I think in this position you are so responsible for everything about the character, and primarily the details. You just have to be such an observer and extract as much as you can. It's like you're an archaeologist just digging for information, and that's been very useful for me as an instructor. I think that it's a wonderful way of reaching students, particularly in a survey of art class, to be able to present the character in a way that they can remember the information. And for me, it was useful to think about teaching and to think about how I might use this approach to make learning easier and more useful.
Thank you. What a nice comment from all three of you. I do want to pause to thank some organizations for making this series possible, both the lecture series and the television programs. The Idaho Humanities Council, the Associated Students at North Idaho College, and the North Idaho College Foundation. Over the past 4 years, they've been very generous and good to us, and that's why you can enjoy these interviews with us. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be continuing this series next week that we call Journey Through Time, what happened in the Western world in the second millennium. We're having a great delight in bringing you these very famous people, and we commend our people here for working so hard to portray those people with such sincerity. Please join us next week when we continue this series. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.